Okay, greetings to everyone, and welcome to yet another installment of our recorded lectures in the course Introduction to Political Science. So last week, we ended off where we looked at what is a discipline. And as it is, or in keeping with the guiding principle for this course, we didn't just look at what is a discipline. In keeping with our principle, what we want to do in this course, as we emphasize time and again, we want to read the course against its own self-understanding. So we basically are showing to the discipline its blind spots. We're going to continue in precisely that same mold. Today, when we look at what is called the approaches to the study of politics. So for us, the interest is not just to regurgitate the approaches as they have been given to us by the discipline itself, but rather we want to say, as the discipline gives to us its own approaches and says, this is how the study of politics has been conducted. These are the approaches that have guided the study of the discipline. We want to be able to speak back to the discipline and say, oh, well and good, this may be how the discipline has understood itself and studied itself, but we want to show what is a limitation of these approaches when looked at from the perspective of the Black colonized. Now, I may also take just this moment, to say a little about, your essay. Now, if you have been watching and listening to the videos carefully, you would have found that actually the answer to the question or to the prompt, to your essay prompt, is contained in these lecture videos. Because virtually in every of these lecture videos, we basically are showing how the limitations of mainstream Western political science emerge as we look at it from our perspective as the Black colonized. Again, today we're going to do precisely that and show what limitations come to the surface when we look at the discipline from the perspective of the Black colonized, more particularly as we look at the approaches to the study of, politics. I also do have to say that the Black colonized, when I say the Black colonized, I'm not speaking about Black people in the past. Those of us who live in the present, Black people who live in the present, they constitute the colonized, because colonialism does not end with the attainment of political independence. Now, I did pick up some where, that you have a sense that the Black colonized is something of the past. No, it is the Black colonized are Black people who live in the present, because the world even today encounters us as Black people in a certain way. I've shown you how the discipline of political science, emerges, and how the discipline of political science is taught today in a manner that is exclusionary, to Black people. So the Black colonized is not a people in the past. It is Black people in the present, because as Black people, there is a certain kind of treatment that Western knowledge reserves for us. But it is not just Western knowledge. There's a certain kind of treatment that the world generally reserves for us as Black people. And that treatment is a function, a logical consequence, of our colonial being. And so when we talk about the Black colonized, we're not talking about people in the past. We're talking about Black people, in the present also. That said, so today in this first installment, we're going to basically look at the approaches to the study of politics. Now, if you look at your reader, there are basically three approaches. There is David Easton's system analysis, which is also known at other times as David Easton's input-output model. There is the institutional approach, and there is the behavioral approach. So in this first installment, we are going to deal with those three approaches, but we are going to rearrange the order just a bit. We're going to begin with the institutional approach, which is actually the first approach in the history of the discipline. And we're going to follow that up with the institutional approach. And then we're going to end this first segment by looking at the behavioral, rather by looking at David Easton's system analysis. Okay. To reiterate, today in this first installment, we're going to look at the three approaches, and we're going to begin with the institutional approach, and we're going to follow that up by looking at the behavioral approach, and then conclude by looking at David Easton's systems analysis. Okay. Let us then begin with the institutional approach. Now, the institutional approach, as I've said, is basically the first approach that was adopted at the moment in the 1920s, to be precise, at the moment when the modern discipline of political science is established. Now, hear this and listen to it well. The modern discipline of political science is a very recent discipline. It starts only in the 1920s, post the First World War in America. So political science, this useless discipline that we study and we teach here called political science, is a fairly recent discipline that starts only in the 1920s, post the First World War, and starts in America. Now, when it starts in America, when it becomes a modern discipline taught in the university and institutionalized in the university, the first approach that became the dominant approach in the study of politics is what is known as the institutional approach. Now, the institutional approach, at the time when the institutional approach was the most dominant approach in the study of political science concerned itself narrowly with just the institutions. And so if you studied political science at the time, all that you studied were basically the institutions. But it was not just any institution that existed, it was legal or statutory institutions, meaning that it was those institutions whose existence was provided for in law. So there could have been other institutions, but political science at the time did not concern itself with those institutions. Its concern was those institutions whose existence is underwritten by law, so to say. Those institutions whose existence is sanctioned by law. So this is why this approach at other times is called the legal institutional approach. The reason it's also called the legal institutional approach is because its concern, the concern of political science, all that political science did at this time was study the legal institutional approach. Rather, was to study the legally provided or provisioned institutions. So as I've said, at this time, when the institutional approach was the dominant approach in the study of politics, political science had a very narrow range. And that range was basically the institutions, the formal legal institutions. And so all that was studied in political science at this time was the parliament, was the executive, was the judiciary, and other institutions that happened to be provided for in law. But by and large, those were the three institutions that political science focused on, because these were the rudimentary institutions of modern political social organization that existed at the time. And so political science, as I've said, had a very narrow range. Its concern was the legal institutions, which means that it was only those institutions whose existence was provided for in law, which is to say that there may have been other institutions, but these institutions were not the concern of political science as long as they were not provided for in law. And so political science for the longest time since the 1920s was concerned narrowly with the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature or parliament, because these were institutions that were provided for in law. These were political institutions provided for in law. There surely would have been other institutions, non-political. But these were the political institutions, or the most prominent political institutions provided for in law. So in order to understand politics at the time, all you needed to understand was these institutions. But it was not just understanding these institutions, it was to understand the existence of these institutions in law. What does that mean? It simply means that those who studied these institutions at the time concerned themselves mainly with what does the law provide for in relation to parliament, in relation to the legislature, in relation to the executive. Every other thing was not their concern in studying these institutions. Their concern was, what are the rules and regulations provided for in law for the functioning of these institutions? So if in the medieval period, all the answers were contained in scripture, in the era when the institutional approach was the most dominant approach, all the answers were provided for in the statutory books. Meaning that if you wanted to understand anything about these institutions, you only had to turn to the relevant statutory books. So, every other thing about the environment, about the culture, about everything else was not of concern to political science dominated by the legal institutional approach. As we've said, at this time, the concern in political science is basically what the law provides for in relation to these institutions. So, the limit of the institutional approach, for instance, shows itself in a number of ways. Now we'll come to the one that is closer to the fact of us being the Black colonized, but you can also see the limitation of just understanding politics in terms of institutions, and in terms of what the law provides in relation to these institutions. Now, if you think of today, present day South Africa, not long ago, a debate raged, for instance, in Parliament about the dress code. And so when the EFF joined Parliament for the first time, they seem to have upset what is an acceptable norm in terms of how to dress in Parliament. And so by coming to Parliament wearing overalls, red overalls, it seemed like they had contravened the law. So you had a number of people who were opposed to that scramble to, define in law what provisions actually existed. So a number of people who were opposed, to that would say things like it was unacceptable, it was against convention, it was against the law, even though eventually we found out that there was actually no law. So, but let's even suppose that there was a law that provided for the dress code. It is that, you see, the limit of focusing only on law supposes that the law itself is supreme to everything else. What it fails to realize is that law on its own is subordinate to some other forces in society. One of which is law is subordinate to politics. In many instances, politics is able to subvert the law. And so, if you focus narrowly just on what the law provides, you are going to miss actually the life of these institutions. Because in most instances, the law itself is not enough, or the law gets subordinated to politics. The second way in which the legal institutional approach showed its limitation will become obvious when we look at the behavioral approach. But even before we look at the behavioral approach, as we have said, the legal institutional approach was the most dominant approach from the 1920s onwards. Its moment, the decisive moment of its failure, so to say, quote and unquote, or when it ceases to be the dominant paradigm, is the 1930s. Why? It is because in the 1930s, when political science is busy studying the institutions, when it's busy, saying that democracy functions when there is a parliament, when there is a judiciary, when there is an executive, and each of them are separate and independent of each other, and the law must provide for the autonomy of one from the other. Whilst political science was obsessed with the legal provisions governing these institutions, there was something else going on in Europe. It is that Hitler in Germany won the elections. And by the way, Hitler won democratic elections. He came to power via a very democratic process. So he was not this absurdity, that he is presented to be today. He actually won elections and came into power. But as soon as he came into power, Hitler began exhibiting what we today know as fascist tendencies. More explicitly, Hitler began killing Jews. And so we remember him now for the Holocaust. So basically what happens as Hitler takes over power democratically and then he begins to kill the Jews in Germany is that because of the Holocaust or the massacre that he's involved in and his subversion of democracy in Germany, political science entered a crisis mode. It entered a crisis mode for two reasons. One is political scientists said, how could we have failed to foresee that it is a possibility that fascism may emerge right under the watch of the law? So political science enters a crisis mode because it thought that it had secured democracy by focusing on the law. And so it thought that as long as the law provides, for instance, how may you ascend to power, as long as the law provides for the relationship between parliament, the judiciary, and the executive, they thought that democracy was secure. But right under that assumption, that presupposition, you had Hitler ascend to power, not only ascending to power, but deciding to kill the Jews. And so political science goes into a tailspin, so to say. It goes into a tailspin because it had assumed that democracy was secured via the prescripts of the law. But the genocide in Germany, of the Jews, happened right in front of them. And so there is a realization within political science that actually, to understand politics, it is not enough to understand institutions and to understand just the legal institutions and to understand what the law provides in relation to those institutions. Because what the example of Hitler taught them was that institutions are actually populated by human beings. They realized, they came to a painful realization for themselves, They came to a painful realization that actually institutions do not depend just on the law in order to function, but they depend on the agency of human beings to operationalize the law. And in order to operationalize the law, people have to interpret it. They have to interpret the provisions of the law in order to operationalize it. So the law is not just an instrument that they take, they're ready to use, and they use. No. The law itself is subject to interpretation, and that interpretation is the domain of human agency, which means then that the very same law may actually be interpreted by people differently. Let me give you an example whilst we are at it. Now, for those who know a little about the history of slavery in America, would know that there was never a law that was provided, or rather there was never a law enacted in America in order to end slavery. The 14th Amendment of the American Constitution, the 13th or 14th Amendment, I'm not sure whether it's the 13th or 14th, but the 13th or 14th Amendment that ended slavery in America, it was not really an amendment as you think of it. All that changed was that the category human was expanded in order to include Black Americans who previously had been thought of to lie beyond the category of human beings. So all that changed in order to end slavery, which said that the enslavement of one human being by another was not acceptable. All that changed was that the category human in that provision that says that the enslavement of one human being by another is not acceptable. All that changed was the interpretation of who is human. It was that same provision that had actually allowed slavery to prevail, because in as much as it said the enslavement of one person by another is not acceptable, slavery was justified on the basis of the fact that Black people were not human. So it was interpretation. Now, all of this I say to drive point home that the law on its own is not enough. We also need to understand that law, in order to be operationalized, gets interpreted. And law gets interpreted differently by human beings under different circumstances. The same sentence in law may be interpreted differently under different circumstances or by different people in the same circumstance. And so, if Black Americans actually had had the right to interpret the law in America under slavery, they would have interpreted it differently to the way that white people interpreted, who said that Black people fall outside of humanity. It's the same thing in South Africa. People tell us that apartheid was legal. Now, the same legal provisions that they rely on, if interpreted by Black people, will surely gain a different meaning. Now, all this I'm emphasizing the point that political science had a very narrow range at a time when the legal institutional approach was the dominant approach, because it focused only on the institutions, not just the institutions, the law that governs the functioning of those institutions. It forgot that the institutions actually are meant by human beings who have agency, and who in exercising their agency give different interpretations to the law. Now, how did political science come to realize that? It was because in Germany, Hitler had ascended to power via democratic processes, and after ascending power via democratic processes, he decided to kill the Jews. And this is when political science is jolted back into its senses. Again, here is the point about the discipline of political science. We see very well that, or let's put the point differently. So the year when Hitler decides to kill the Jews is 1935. Well, it starts before 1935, but you know, it is between 1939 and 1945, the beginning of the Second World War and the end of the Second World War. Now, if this is 1939, we know very well that massacres had been conducted by white people in this continent prior to that. In 1921, there had been a massacre in South Africa where white people massacred Black people in what is known as the Queenstown Massacre. For those who come from the Eastern Cape, they would know a town, you know, known as Queenstown. In 1921, white people had massacred annihilated Black people there. In 1904, white people had annihilated all the Herero people in Namibia. But political science was not moved. It is only when white people are killed by other white people, by Hitler, that political science is jolted back to its sensibility, which simply tells us that this knowledge has never been concerned with us as Black people. In its horizon of meaning, as Black people, we do not feature, because if political science realized its limitations or the limitations of the legal institutional approach as a result of Hitler killing other white people, the question has to be, why did political science recognize its limitations when white people killed Black people in Queenstown, when white people killed Black people, you know, in Namibia, or in several other parts of the continent where Black people had been annihilated by white people? The point is simply that political science, not just political science, modern disciplinary knowledges begin from the sensibilities of white people. It is incapable, modern disciplinary knowledges are incapable of recognizing injustice when injustice is suffered by Black people. We see it here with the legal institutional approach, but also the important point is that the development of the discipline has never been informed by the experiences, the lived experiences of the Black people, because here we have the lived experience of Black people, of the Black colonized, being annihilated by white people, but this lived experience does not have any meaning or does not have any impact in the development or in the forward movement of the discipline of political science. It takes Hitler to do to white people, because all Hitler did, Hitler committed no crime. All Hitler did was to do to white people what white people had reserved for us, Black people. And so his crime, if he had a crime, was to do unto white people what white people had thought was right to do only to Black people. And so, We must see the Holocaust in exactly the same way that we must see the massacre of the Herero people. In exactly the same way, we must see the Queenstown massacre and several other massacres that happened across the continent. We must not privilege one massacre over the others. But you know why we privilege one over others? It is because modern disciplinary knowledge privileges that one, because as we've just seen, the institutional approach became delegitimized simply because it was unable to preempt white people killing each other, Hitler killing the Jews. That it was not able to preempt white people killing black people in Namibia and in South Africa seems not to matter in its life. Okay, so we've made the point sufficiently. The institutional approach becomes dominant from the 1920s until the 1930s, until Hitler does to white people what white people had reserved for black people. So what this shows us is the fact that the forward movement of the discipline has never been informed by the lived experiences of black people, but rather by the lived experience of white people. Because it is when white people die that the discipline shows any forward movement. When black people die, it is not moved. Okay. So the legal institutional approach became delegitimized as a result of its failure to preempt what Hitler did, to white people. And there was a realization that, as we've said, institutions are actually populated by human beings. Institutions depend on the agency of human beings to interpret the law. So the law on its own is not sufficient. And all of this political science realizes because of developments in Europe, or not developments in Europe, because of white people killing each other. When white people kill black people, this did not make political science come to this realization. And so it shows us, or it tells us, that our lived experiences as the black colonized have never really been at the center of the discipline of political science. But as we have said, the institutional approach became delegitimized, and in its place came the behavioral approach. Now, the behavioral approach became dominant, became the dominant paradigm in political science from the 1950s, particularly from the late 1950s. And what was the behavioral approach? Now, the behavioral approach was not just limited to political science. If you study sociology, you would hear of the behavioral approach. You would hear of it in other social science disciplines. The behavioral approach was nothing but an attempt by political science and other social sciences to render themselves as scientific as the natural sciences. So if the legal institutional approach had shown the limitations of political science, it was hoped that if political science became as scientific as the natural sciences, then it should be able, or it ought to be able to predict developments just like the natural sciences are able to predict developments. So the behavioral approach was basically marked by an adoption in the social sciences of the methodology of the natural sciences. The behavioral approach saw the importation into the social sciences of the methods of the natural sciences. So this was an attempt, as I've said, to render social sciences as scientific as the natural sciences. And this attempt meant the adoption of the same scientific method that is used in the natural sciences, the adoption of that method in the social sciences, because the hope, as I've said, was that if the social sciences adopted the same method as the natural sciences, then they would be as scientific as the natural sciences. Now, what makes the natural sciences more scientific, or at that time, in the eyes of the social scientists, what made the natural sciences scientific? So this hanker, or this hankering, towards scientificity, what did it mean? What would have made political science feel more secure as a science that it saw in the natural sciences? Simply put, the method of the natural sciences enables sciences to reach conclusions that are true across time and space. The natural sciences are able to reach conclusions that are true and valid across time and space. And this is what we call nomothetic statements. Statements that are not limited in their validity by neither by time nor space. This is what we call nomothetic statements. On the other hand, statements that are limited in their validity by time and by space, we call ideographic statements. So this move by the by the social sciences towards universality, or towards universal validity, was a move from ideographic statements towards nomothetic statements. The social sciences wanted to be able to move away from making conclusions that are nomothetic towards being able to make conclusions that, or rather, sorry, the social sciences, by adopting the method of the natural sciences, wanted to be able to move from being able to make ideographic statements to being able to make nomothetic statements. Because nomothetic statements are those statements whose validity is not encumbered neither by time nor space. Whereas ideographic statements are statements whose validity is constrained by time and space. So the social sciences wanted to be like the natural sciences. And so they adopted the methodology of the natural sciences. And so this was called the behavioral revolution. This is what constituted what became known as the behavioral revolution, not just in political science, but in the whole of the social sciences. Now, to show you that the behavioral revolution did not just affect political science only, it also affected all the other social science disciplines. In fact, it was economics and psychology that actually moved even faster than political science, even further than political science, in embracing the behavioral revolution. How? So psychology, to begin with psychology began to use precisely the same methods of experimentation and of the laboratory that were used in the natural sciences. I do not know whether psychology still does, but one of the first things that psychology did as a result of the behavioral revolution was to begin a method of studying people's subconscious by attaching to them electrolytes, that they could use in order to read the functioning of the brain when people, for instance, were in their sleep. Now, there is a long theory of, how the subconscious comes back into life, during our sleep. But the point for us at this point is simply that psychology embraced the same methods of the laboratory. It took people into the laboratory and attached to their brain, to their head, electrolytes, in order to use them to read the functioning of the brain in their sleep. In this way, psychology was trying to make itself scientific. On the other hand, economics began to use statistics in order to validate itself. So it began to use the method of statistical validation in order to make itself scientific. And so the adoption, for instance, by economics of statistics led to the development of that branch of economics called today econometrics, which is, the mathematics, of economics, which is largely, concerned with modeling. Now, this was the attempt by other social sciences to make themselves scientific, or this was the response, so to say, of these disciplines towards the behavioral revolution. Political science also did exactly the same. It also began to use statistics, and later on, this would be grafted into political science as what is today called the quantitative method. Now, you'd encounter this later on, in your study of political science, the quantitative method. But the point we're making now is that the behavioral approach was basically an attempt to make the social sciences more scientific, to make the social sciences as scientific as natural sciences. And this they did by adopting the methods of the natural sciences, because according to them, the methods of the natural sciences enabled them to reach conclusions that are not idiographic, but rather that are nomothetic. But there was something else. There was something else less acknowledged. It is that science has always had three purposes. So when the natural sciences engage in their scientific method, their purpose is to explain. Their purpose is to explain. Their purpose is to predict. And their third purpose is to control, because if you can predict, then you can control. So the purpose of science, of the natural sciences, let's begin this way. The purpose of the natural sciences has always been to explain, to predict, and to control. Now, if the purpose of the natural sciences has always been to explain, to predict, and to control, because what you can predict, you can control. If the purpose of the natural sciences has always been to explain, to predict, and to control, the social sciences, in trying to become like the natural sciences, in adopting the model of the natural sciences, they also adopted this triple heritage, so to say, which is science's purpose. The social sciences began to think of themselves as being seized with the task of explaining, predicting, and then to control. Now, once you say the purpose of science is to control, there is an element of power that comes into it. You can't control what you don't have power over. Once you say control, you call forth an exercise of power over what you control. So science is able to exert its power of control over its objects. And science actually also defines us as objects. And so, for instance, if you go to a medical doctor often enough, without, hardly would you complete a consultation with a medical doctor without them saying, we have to control 1, 2, 3 in you. We have to control your sugar level. We have to control your cholesterol level. We have to control whatever. Now, what do you control? You exercise power over. And so you can see in the way a doctor relates to you, when he or she is speaking to you, he doesn't expect you to speak back. When they say, because we want to control X, Y, and Z in you, then you have to do 1, 2, 3. The doctor doesn't expect you to say, but why should I not eat meat? Couldn't we control it in another way? The doctor at that point assumes himself or herself to have absolute control over you because he or she is possessed of the ethic of science. So the ethic of science is the ethic of domination. It's the same thing in the social sciences. Post the behavioral revolution, you find political scientists and social sciences also trying to mimic the natural sciences and trying to exercise control. And they forget here that their own subject is human beings, not as patients, but as people acting out their agency. And so, for instance, you hear people who call themselves political analysts on TV, predicting political developments. What will happen in the ANC, if 1, 2, 3, if Ace Magashule is suspended. People give us all sorts of permutations what will happen. They forget one thing: human beings have agency. Why do you suppose that they will break away? What if they decide not to break away? Because remember, they have agency. What they are going to do is what they are going to decide at that point of the decision. You only have to think of how many times you've had people say the ANC is going to break up. It never does, but the same political scientist who yesterday told us the ANC will break up tomorrow. It doesn't. They call the same person back to make another prediction that comes to naught. And then they say it's science. There's no science over human beings who have agency because they decide how to act out of their own volitions. You can't predict as though they were objects. You can read patterns in human behavior, but you can't predict, meaning that what you find in the social sciences is an attempt to exercise control or to exercise power as a result of the behavioral revolution. Now, lest we miss it, white social scientists throughout the colonial period have always been able to exercise power over Black objects who they study because they were able to back up their power of science with the power of the state. And so when anthropologists, for instance, went around studying Black people all over the continent, they did not expect any resistance from people because if people resisted, they knew they would call on the force of the state. In today's language, white people still are able to exercise that control. They no longer depend on coercive power. Remember, we said power exercises itself or manifests itself in several other ways. So they are still able to call on other forms of power, which Black social scientists aren't able to call. Now, let me try and exemplify this. Later on in your studies, let's put it differently. So one of the things I teach at higher levels of study is an honors and master's course in research methods. And often enough, I get students who come to me and say that, oh, well, I want to study, for instance, how household expenditure, is, or how people, expend their household income to what do they, expend their household income. So these are studies that for a long time were very dominant, not for a long time, but for a while, there was an obsession about how households expend their income. And, a student would come to me and say, oh, that's what I want to study for my honors or a master's. I said, that's fine. Where are you going to do this? Then they say, oh, I'm going to do it in Khayelitsha. Okay. And then I say, well and good. And what are you going to do? How are you going to conduct it? Then they would say, oh, I'm going to go, to Khayelitsha or to Gugulethu, and I'm going to have an interview. I'm going to go to each family and ask them, so how much do you make a month? And, to what do you expend the income? So how much do you spend on food? How much do you spend on, transport and all of that? I say, well and good. Often, of course, it's a Black student or a white student. This is common. And then I would say, if it's a Black student, now that's very good. So, but why don't you reverse the scale? Rather than go to Khayelitsha, go and do exactly the same research in Constantia amongst white people. And that would mean that if you are going to go to Khayelitsha and walk into the Dlamini household and gather the Dlaminis and ask, all of them there present, how much do you make, to what does your income go? Now you must go to Constantia and gather the Westhuizens and ask Mr. Westhuizen in the presence of Mrs. Westhuizen, how much do you make and to what do you expend your income? Suddenly it becomes impossible. Suddenly it seems you have said to the student, he or she must go bring heavens. It seems impossible. You know why? Because that law of control, when Black people have studied Western science, social science, whose purpose is to explain, to predict, and to control, they also think of themselves as being possessed of that power to control. That power to control, you have it only towards Black people. You don't have it towards white people. Because you can't gather them, just like you can gather Black people. So you think it easy that, oh no, I'm going to interview, Black families in Khayelitsha. But suddenly when you are asked to go interview white families in Constantia, it seems impossible. The point I'm making is that the behavioral revolution brought into the social sciences the same ethic of control, which means an exercise of power over your objects of study. Because remember, natural scientists have absolute control over what they study. When natural scientists go to the laboratory, they need to be able to control everything, including the temperature, including, every variable in the room, in the laboratory. They must have absolute control over. That's the ethic of domination that social scientists brought into the social sciences, when they adopted the model of the natural sciences. For white scholars, it was possible to do so because they could back their power with state power. When they lost state power, for instance, in South Africa, they can back that power using the non-symbolic, the non-material forms of power that we spoke of, the law of status, the law of money, and other forms of symbolic power. So, again, we see how the progress of the discipline of political science has never been informed by the lived experiences of the Black colonized. It is always the lived experience, it privileges the lived experiences of the white, subject. So we've looked at institutional approach, we've looked at the behavioral approach. We will end this installment, of the recording here and begin the next installment by looking at David Easton's systems analysis. Thank you very much.